Hi there, and welcome to Theology Thursday. If you go out and purchase a Bible or a book, it's going to be probably in this format, or it may be in your pocket in this format. But in Bible times, they did not have, obvious electronic devices, and they didn't have this. This is known as a book, what we call it, but actually it's called a codex, which is just a term that means bound this way with writing on pages, front and back kind of thing, like you would get if you went and purchased a book today. But in Bible times, they wrote on other things, and they wrote with the different things, and everything was done by hand. So I just wanted to take a little time today and just talk about what they wrote on in Bible times and how they wrote. I know this is not really kind of theology, but it is somewhat interesting to know how they recorded what they wanted to have recorded and written in the ancient world. Most of the time, they wrote on clay pieces. They would write on wood, but of course that disappears over time. They would write in wax. They would make impressions in wax. Maybe not so much write, but they would do what's called a boule. So like you've seen where the king takes his ring and stamps in the hot wax to seal a scroll or a letter or something like that. And so they would not like write in those, but they would make impressions, and oftentimes those would have like the name of the king and the country or the name of the prince or the person of wealth or whatever, and maybe even like their house emblem or something like that. And so they would do it in wax, a lot of stuff. But the primary thing they would use were clay pieces. Now, the reason I say clay pieces is because almost everything that they used was made of clay. Plates, cups, a lot of cooking utensils were made out of clay. There were just a lot of oil lamps were just made out of clay. They didn't have glass like we think of. Like if you go buy a lamp today, it's glass, but it was basically just a little clay holding thing for oil with a place they could put a wick and light it and provide light for themselves. And of course, these things get dropped and they get broken. And so much like today, you might take a piece of paper that you've used and cut it up into pieces and use the back for scratch paper, or you got a Post-it note sort of thing. Well, that's what they would do in Bible times. They would take these broken pieces of pottery called pottery shards, or ostraca, and they would write on them. We actually have recovered one that was a boy practicing his alphabet. And so we've recovered many, many of these. A lot of them are just simply a grocery list. Sometimes there were some less important legal things, like I'll let you graze the field this week and I'll graze it next week kind of thing. And so we have a lot of recordings just of regular daily life stuff on these, and we have recovered them by the thousands. And so there would be a lot of ostraca, a lot of these broken clay tablets. That's what average people would use. But then there were also some other things that were more official, government documents and treaties and things. And these typically occurred on 4 different types of material. The first one would be papyrus. That's where we get the word paper. This came from the papyrus plant. It was developed in Egypt. And because Egypt is such a dry, arid climate, papyrus documents, some of them have actually survived. They're not in great shape after a couple thousand years, but they do survive a very, very, very long time. You would take them and you would weave them together, the strips from the papyrus plant, and wet them and form them into a mat and make paper. And so that's where paper comes from. So there were things done on paper. There are also clay tablets. Now, this is not pottery that's been broken, but these are tablets that they would have a wooden form, and they would make clay, and they would put the clay in the form, and then they would write on the clay while it was soft, and then it would harden, and you would have this clay tablet. And so much of what we have discovered from the ancient Near East to help us understand the Bible are these clay tablets. Libraries of thousands of them have been discovered. Some of them are broken in places, but lots and lots and lots of clay tablets. Now, they didn't have an alphabet like ours, most of their alphabet was made out of little triangular-shaped symbols. And then so they would have a stick with a little triangle on the end, basically, and they would arrange them together. It's called cuneiform. And that's how they would write on these clay tablets. And like I said, we've uncovered lots and lots of them. So let me just show you a few that have been uncovered. So here's one. You can see that this was a clay tablet. It was wet. They put this stuff down. Of course, these would be important documents. Here's one. You can kind of see some of the triangular shapes. They would do them sometimes on cylinders. These were in some ways easier to carry because they took up less space, and so you would have these cylinders. There's a famed one called the Cyrus cylinder, which is very similar to what we find at the beginning of the book of Ezra. Here's a close-up of cuneiform. You'll see the triangular shapes, and they would just make these impressions in different arrangements, kind of like we do circles and straight lines and things. You stop the circle from going all the way around to make the letter C, and a circle with a stick on the right side's a D, a circle with a stick on the left side's a B. So they would just arrange these in different ways to make different letters, and so here are more of those. Many of these were actually just hand-sized, and so here's a kind of a perspective of my hand. So you can see they would hold it in your hand, and you would use the stylus, and you would make the various letters. Here's another one, some that are a little bit larger. They're by my wife's hand, and then some were quite large. These were very important government documents or treaties. You can see the size there by my wife's hand. And so much of what they would do in the ancient world was on these clay tablets, and they would impress the letters and then would harden. Of course, that's going to last for quite some time. It's believed that somewhere around 1200 BC, they began to write on leather as well, like a leather scroll. And this would involve an ink, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Some of these leather scrolls have survived in the form of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are somewhere between 200 BC and the time of Jesus. And so they're a couple of thousand years old and have survived, as well as some other leather documents that have been saved over the years. Leather, of course, is much lighter in terms of weight than a clay tablet. It's fairly permanent if the leather's been cured well. But it was easier to travel with leather documents than it was actually making the impressions in clay. And then if you wanted something permanent, like really permanent, you could put it in copper, engrave it in copper, or engrave it in stone. If you go to Italy today, you can still see many of the arches and carvings from the Roman Empire, and you can read what's there. I mean, when you carve it in stone, it's permanent. That's why I even say, man, that's carved in stone, meaning we think it's permanent. But most of the documents that relate to helping us understand the world around the Old Testament come primarily from clay tablets, from broken pottery pieces to learn about everyday life of people, and then some, like I said, leather documents and things. Now, what would they write with? Well, we've already talked about the stylus, and so they would make the cuneiform things. They would take a pen and dip it in an inkwell, or obviously they would use chisels. If it's going to be made into stone, you're going to chisel it into stone. Again, if it was leather, these were scrolls. If it was papyrus, they were scrolls. And the average scroll length was about 30 feet, 25 to 30 feet. That's why if you read through the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, all these books are all basically the same length. It's because that's the length of a scroll. As a matter of fact, Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1, 2 Kings, all 6 of those books are really just one long story. But you can't fit them all, the story on one scroll. So that's why we have a 1 and a 2 Samuel. The story just keeps going. But you can only get so much on a scroll, and so that's why those are divided that way. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, those are all one scroll apiece. The book of the 12, the minor prophets, all 12 of those books form a scroll. Proverbs forms a scroll. And so you can see why so many of the books are roughly the same size. And even the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all about the same length. was a scroll. Now, smaller scrolls would have been letters. That's why many of Paul's letters are smaller. They would have a smaller scroll instead of a really big scroll. And so that's, what they would write on. Now, where do you get ink from? Well, they used a lot of lamps. And so the ink is called ink black or lamp black. And that's, where it gets smudged. And you take all of that black smudge from the lamp and you can put a little bit of water or something in there, and you can create an ink. And so they would use lamp black, was very popular. Metallic powders. In Job, he says, "Oh, that my words were written in iron." And they would use iron in the ink. Matter of fact, if you've seen that movie National Treasure, they talk about that, in iron written. And, they used iron to make ink. And so they would use metallic powders. And then obviously from plants, you have juices and resins and things, from different berries and all that you could use to create ink as well. And so those were the things that they would do. Now I wanted to finish out just by showing you, when we talk about things being written in the ancient world, how important they could be and how we can learn about them. One of the most famous discoveries of all time is Hammurabi's Code. And it is a set of 232 laws that were given by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And we know about him, not Nebuchadnezzar, Hammurabi, the Babylonian king Hammurabi, and its laws that they were to follow. And they were so important that they were written on a big stela, a big black obelisk, basically, so that they could be displayed in public and everyone could read them, and we have uncovered them. And so I want to show you Hammurabi's Code and how big it is. So this is Hammurabi's Code, and you can see the size of it. Of course, it's sitting a little bit on a platform here, but would reach up 8 to 10 feet. Here is a little bit of a close-up of it, and here's a real close-up. You can see it was written in cuneiform and the little triangular-shaped things with a stylus and line after line. And so this is Hammurabi's Code, and you're looking at something that's over 3,000 years old. So this was important to put in there. And those laws, we can see the similarities between Israel's law and the Bible and the distinctions between God's law and Hammurabi's. And there's a lot of distinction there, and I don't have time to cover all of it today, but I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what they wrote on and how they wrote. And it's important for us because not only is the Bible brought down to us through writing over the centuries, but also other documents have survived, which help us to set the Bible in the context of the world in which it was, and helps us sometimes to better understand what we're reading in the Bible, particularly when it talks about Baal worship or Moloch worship or different kings or different countries. We actually have recovered many of those documents that explain a great deal of that to give more depth and breadth to our understanding of the Bible. So, man, the next time you pick up your Bible, or the next time you reach into your pocket and you pull out your Bible or your Kindle to read a book, man, be thankful. Be thankful you don't got some giant scroll that's 30 feet long, or you're writing by hand on a piece of broken pottery. Be thankful for the printed text and how much easier it is for us to communicate in writing than it was in Bible times.